for asking that great question. And it has a long history now, scenario planning, although not necessarily in the corporate sector. It started really after the Second World War, not to go into too much history, but it illustrates why the technique was developed. And in particular, Herman Kahn, who faced, and the Rand Corporation, when the nuclear weapons were used for the first time in the Second World War, the question after the war, Second World War, was, so what is a world of nuclear annihilation like? And Herman Kahn, a very brilliant scientist at the Rand Corporation, he said our normal ways of thinking cannot deal with that problem because it's an unprecedented problem. Ordinarily, we would go back in the past, but what is a comparable case to global annihilation and maybe the end of our human civilization? And he called this Gedanken, from the German, thoughts, Gedanken experiments, just like Einstein did, imagining he's on a bullet going at the speed of light and seeing what the world looks like from that perspective. So I think scenario planning has an unusual feature in that it wants to solve problems through human imagination, not just looking at only data and deduction and induction, but also this capacity to see worlds that have not yet existed. And in the technology domain, where innovations can be remarkable, that is especially important. But the methodology in many ways is very natural for human beings. The way we educate our children is we tell them stories, we tell them narratives, and these narratives are memorable, and they're interesting, they're engaging, and they convey key lessons. And you might say that if you're company X and you look out 10 years into the future, what are the 4 or 3 or 2 or 5, but that's about the range in which you want to do it, what are the different narratives that we should be telling each other and preparing for that describe worlds that are quite different from what we have seen? You might have one scenario that extends essentially through extrapolation the world that is operating now. So the first thing in scenario planning, if you do a 10-year view of the future, you might just say, what are some trends in the social and political and economic and technological and environmental domains that you are willing to bet your future on? You might say the aging population, I'm going to bet that that's going to be with it. We can debate how quickly and all of that, but the direction of that. So trends are directional forces that you're like a vector that you are willing to bet your strategy on. And that could, I mentioned, the aging population, but it could, of course, be climate change problems that are going to be with us. That's not going to be taken off the table so quickly either. But scenario planning is, above all, about addressing the unknowns, the uncertainties, what we would call the critical or key uncertainties, that you don't really want to bet on. Yeah, you can always bet on it being a recession or high growth or whatever, but that's dangerous. Then you're gambling. So scenario planning says, let's at least take the things that we are not willing to bet on. So the crystal ball question, what are the 5 things you would like to ask a crystal ball about your future environment? We're talking about the external environment, the things you don't control, the exogenous part of the world. And what would those be? Are those economic questions? Are they technology questions? Are they political questions, ethical questions, social questions, ecological questions? Extraterrestrial questions. You decide what it is, and those are the ingredients. So if you say there's some constancy in the world, the sun will probably rise again tomorrow. Let's take that as a given. Although maybe the Pentagon shouldn't do that, but most people would do that. So it depends on where you're sitting and how much uncertainty you need to get your arms around. But these 2 ingredients of trends, which are the predictable part of the future, and the uncertainties, the unpredictable part, that's what you play with. And that's the stew from which you concoct scenarios. But the idea is not to put them together just at random. So first of all, if you really believe that there's 10 trends that are important, they should exist in every scenario. They are the same in the aging population. If you really believe that's going to happen, it should be in every scenario. Now, the question is, does that trend contradict some of the uncertainties that may play out? And so you need to make sure that these scenarios are coherent, that you can weave a causal narrative that takes you from the current initial conditions, let's say now T0, and then T10, 10 years later. You depict a narrative of what the world may be like. But it's not just a photograph of what 10 years from now your industry may look like. It is really meant to be a movie because you want to explain the logic. You say, and George and I did a big one on the future of the biosciences, which is a huge topic that covers, many healthcare industries and biotech and prevention. So it wasn't necessarily a very well-defined problem, and the purpose of these scenarios were not to predict or to get it right, but it was really about acknowledging how much we don't know about certain things and to stimulate our thinking about where risks and opportunities may come from. Now, if you think of, I'm actually in Florida here, imagine that you get a hurricane hitting the coastal areas. You see these cones, and the cones every day get more specific about which parts of the coast will be hit. Well, that's what a scenario tries to do as well. Imagine you have a cone for the future, and it is 10 years out, and then it's going to be 9 years out and 8 years out, and more precision happens. So these scenarios are initial stories that then get updated. So each year you might say, what are the things that happened this year that have some relevance to these scenarios, and do they make some scenarios more probable, more compelling, and do they diminish the likelihood or the consequences of these others? Now, at Royal Dutch Shell, where I spent some time in their corporate planning group on a 2-year sabbatical in London, we would not give probabilities to these scenarios. They're not sufficiently well defined in terms of an outcome space. So we gave all of them about equal weight. You can certainly debate and say, I think this scenario should have more weight. But that weight is not just probability, that weight also reflects consequences. So I think that the scenario that I or you, God forbid, have a heart attack in the next 5 years may be a low probability, but since it is so consequential, you may give it, in terms of your eating habits and your exercise, more weight than the probability would have if you wanted to assign probabilities. And the idea then is ultimately to test your strategies. It's like a wind tunnel, you have a plan and you have some scenarios now, and that's just like Boeing does. Let's see if this plane holds up as we crank up, the wind from different directions, etc. And when does it break? When it's destructive testing. And in most cases, that in my experience, is that the current plan that is supported by the organization is usually only a winner in 1 or 2, but seldom in all of the scenarios. And the fact that you can just point that out, that our current plan will not work in scenario A, let's say, but it will work in scenario C, well, that sets up a conversation about how can we build more flexibility into the plan so that we see the turning point sooner, and that we build in more robustness into our strategy or more flexibility. The ideal is, of course, that you can have elements in your plan that are what McKinsey used to call no regret moves. No matter what happens, you're happy you invested in your brand or in your IP platform. And there will be some of those, and you hired excellent people. Those are usually very safe moves, maybe not so dependent on the scenario. But what particular factories to build, or what products to launch, or who to do partnerships with, that may be very dependent on the scenario. So for those, you want to build in that flexibility. And flexibility, by definition, if you want to utilize it, requires early warning signals. So you can see sooner which way the wind is going to blow. And that gets us back to peripheral scanning and weak signals. So there's a very natural coupling, I think, between weak signals and being vigilant, then developing better viewpoints about the future so that these weak signals have a place and context within which they can be understood, and then making investments that are honest about this uncertainty, and that gets you then into the real options way of thinking, that all strategies are essentially bets on future where you don't commit 100%, but you keep some flexibility so that you can make midstream adjustments later. And that, I think, is sort of the natural strategy cycle that couples these 3 subjects that we discussed.